I am Martha Higgins. At 68 years old, I've learned that the most profound silences aren't found in empty rooms, but in the moments just before a predator breathes. Out here, in the sun-bleached stretches of West Texas, where the wind carries the scent of dust and ancient secrets, I don't live alone. Most people my age are surrounded by grandchildren or quiet gardens, but my twilight years are guarded by something the world considers a monster. They call him a beast, a killer, a creature that should only exist in the heart of the savanna. But to me, he is Duke. He is 200 kilograms of golden muscle, bone-crushing power, and a loyalty so fierce it defies every law of nature. 5 years ago, I pulled a dying spark of life from a twisted wreck of metal, and in return, he gave me a reason to never be afraid of the dark again. But tonight, the air is different. The heavy thud of boots on my porch doesn't belong to a friend, and the metallic click of a holster being unclipped echoes too loudly in the desert night. I can hear Duke's breath, a low, rhythmic vibration that rattles the floorboards beneath my feet. His golden eyes are fixed on the door, his upper lip curling just enough to reveal teeth that could end a life in a single heartbeat. He isn't just a pet, he is a king, protecting his only subject. The world is coming to take him away, claiming that a woman like me cannot control a force of nature like him. They don't realize that I don't control him, he chooses to stay. And as the shadow outside moves closer, I realize that the blood on the porch tonight might not be mine, but I'm the only one who can stop the coming storm. Before we dive into the heart-pounding secrets of how a retired surgeon and a lion became the most unlikely pair in Texas, I have a small request for you. Please let me know in the comments, what time is it where you are, and which city are you watching from? I truly want to see how far Martha and Duke's journey has traveled across the globe. And if you believe that a bond of love can be more powerful than the wildest instinct, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss a single second of the breathtaking twists waiting just ahead. It began 5 years ago on a night when the Texas sky turned the color of bruised plums. The air was thick with the electric charge of an approaching supercell, a heavy, suffocating pressure that made the cattle restless and the windmills groan in protest. Martha Higgins stood on her porch, watching the horizon flicker with jagged veins of violet lightning, feeling the familiar ache in her joints that always preceded a legendary southern storm. She had spent the afternoon securing the barn doors, her mind drifting to Arthur and how he used to claim he could smell the rain coming from 3 counties away. The first drops hit the dust like bullets, kicking up small puffs of red earth before the heavens finally opened in a relentless, blinding sheet of water. It was an hour past midnight when the sound reached her through the roar of the rain, a violent metallic screech that tore through the rhythm of the storm, followed by a dull, ground-shaking thud. Martha didn't hesitate. She grabbed her heavy canvas coat and a high-powered flashlight, her old medical instincts overriding the common sense that told her to stay inside. The mud pulled at her boots as she struggled toward the edge of the ranch road where the asphalt met the scrubland. Through the grey curtain of the downpour, she saw the silhouette of a massive vehicle lying on its side, its wheels still spinning uselessly in the air like the legs of a dying insect. It was an unmarked transport truck, white paint chipped and scarred with reinforced steel bars visible through the shattered rear doors. The smell of leaking diesel and scorched rubber was acrid, burning her nostrils as she climbed over the debris. She expected to find a driver in need of a tourniquet or a passenger trapped by a seatbelt, but the cabin was empty, the windshield kicked out from the inside. As she turned her light toward the mangled cargo area, the beam caught something that made her heart stutter against her ribs. Among the twisted wreckage of heavy iron cages and shredded burlap, a small golden shape lay half-buried under a fallen steel partition. It wasn't a calf or a local coyote. The broad forehead and the oversized paws revealed a predator that had no business being in the heart of the Lone Star State. Martha knelt in the oily slush, her hands moving with the precision of a woman who had spent decades in trauma wards, lifting the cold metal off the creature's shivering frame. It was a lion cub no more than 10 weeks old, its fur matted with a mixture of red mud and dark, sticky blood. One of its hind legs was pinned at an unnatural angle, and its breathing was shallow, a desperate rasping sound that echoed the fragility of a flickering candle. The cub's eyes remained closed, but as Martha's warm fingers brushed against its neck, checking for a pulse, a tiny instinctive hiss escaped its throat. Most people would have recoiled or called the sheriff's department, immediately reporting the illegal transport of an exotic beast, but Martha saw only a patient that the world had already discarded. She knew that if she called for help, the authorities would see a liability, a dangerous commodity that would be euthanized before the sun rose. She looked at the empty road, then back at the broken animal, and felt a surge of protective fury that she hadn't experienced since she lost her husband. She gathered the cub into her arms, wrapping him in her heavy coat, feeling the sudden sharp weight of him against her chest. The heat from her body began to seep into his chilled skin, and for a fleeting second, the cub's head rested in the crook of her elbow, a silent surrender to the only kindness he had ever known. She carried him back through the deluge, her footsteps heavy but purposeful, bypassing the phone on the kitchen wall and heading straight for the sterile environment of her old home office. She laid him out on the stainless steel table she used for occasional local emergencies, the overhead lights reflecting in the pool of rainwater dripping from her hair. She worked for hours in a focused silence, cleaning the deep lacerations with antiseptic and setting the fractured bone with the steady hands of a master surgeon. She used silk sutures to close the wounds, her mind cataloguing the supplies she would need to buy in town without raising suspicion. There was no growling now, only the rhythmic click of her instruments and the distant rumble of the retreating storm. When the first grey light of dawn began to creep through the window, the cub was breathing steadily, his small chest rising and falling under a thick wool blanket. Martha sat in the wooden chair beside the table, her clothes still damp, watching the way his ears twitched in his sleep. She knew the risks of what she was doing. Harboring a lion was a felony, but harboring a desert king was a death sentence for her reputation. Yet, as the cub finally opened his eyes, deep amber pools that reflected the strength of a survivor, she saw a mirror of her own solitude. She reached out, letting him sniff the scent of antiseptic and rain on her palm, and felt a soft, sandpaper-like tongue rasp against her skin. It was the first contact a bridge built between two species in the quiet aftermath of a tragedy. She decided then that he wouldn't be a statistic in a government report or a trophy for a black market collector. He would be her secret, a living ghost in the vast Texas scrub. She whispered a name into the stillness of the room, a name that carried the weight of nobility and the grit of the land. She called him Duke, not because of a title, but because of the quiet dignity he maintained even in his broken state. The crimson rain had brought him to her door, washing away his past and binding his fate to a woman who had nothing left to lose. She moved her hand to his head, feeling the soft fuzz behind his ears, and for the first time in 5 years, the crushing weight of her widowhood felt a little lighter. The house, which had been a tomb of memories, suddenly felt like a sanctuary again, filled with the raw, undetamed pulse of a new life. Martha looked out at the muddy fields, knowing the truck would be found soon and the questions would begin. But she also knew she would go to any lengths to keep this golden miracle hidden. She stood up to prepare a bottle of warmed milk and supplements her shadow, stretching long across the floor, merging with the shadow of the small king resting on her table. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world that looked the same but had changed forever in the span of a single night. She wasn't just a widow anymore. She was a guardian, a keeper of the wild, and the journey that began in the mud and blood of a Texas highway was about to rewrite the laws of her world. Healing a lion isn't like fixing a broken wing. It's like trying to hold a wildfire in your palms. The first weeks in the makeshift infirmary of Martha's home office were a blur of sleepless nights and the metallic tang of antiseptic. Duke's recovery was nothing short of miraculous, fueled by a primal resilience that seemed to defy the severity of his injuries. As the fractures knit together and the deep lacerations faded into silver scars, the tiny cub began to reclaim his true nature, transforming from a shivering ball of fur into a curious, energetic predator. Martha found herself caught in a delicate dance of survival, balancing the demands of medical care with the absolute necessity of silence. She knew that every mewl, every playful pounce, and every scratch against the floorboards carried the risk of exposure. She began a systematic process of conditioning, using hand signals and low rhythmic whispers to communicate, teaching the golden cub that silence was his greatest protection. The quiet of the Texas plains became her ally, but the logistics of harboring a growing apex predator were staggering. A lion cub's appetite is a relentless engine, and Martha soon realized that her modest grocery runs were no longer sufficient. She began making long trips to neighboring counties, buying large quantities of raw meat from different butchers to avoid suspicion. She told the local clerks she was making bulk jerky or feeding a new pack of rescue hounds, her voice never wavering despite the knot of anxiety tightening in her chest. The cost was astronomical, draining her savings by thousands of dollars, yet she viewed every penny as an investment in a soul that had been left for dead. The office, once a place of sterile order, became a sanctuary of shadows and soft textures, filled with the scent of wild hay and the low, vibrating hum of Duke's purr. Their bond deepened in the stillness of the night, two solitary beings finding a strange, unspoken comfort in each other's presence. Martha would sit on the floor, her back against the old wooden cabinet, watching Duke bat at a ball of heavy twine. He would often rest his heavy head in her lap, his amber eyes tracking the movement of her hands with a startling intelligence. This fragile peace was shattered on a Tuesday afternoon when a heavy, familiar knock echoed through the house. Caleb Vance, a retired sheriff's deputy and Martha's closest neighbor for over 20 years, stood on the porch with a basket of fresh peaches and a look of deep concern. Caleb was a man of the earth, his face etched with the lines of decades spent under the harsh Texas sun, and he possessed an intuitive sense for when things were amiss. He had noticed the lights burning late into the night and the absence of Martha's truck from its usual spots in town. As Martha opened the door, she tried to maintain her usual composure, but the sudden sharp sound of a heavy object falling in the office made her breath hitch. Caleb's eyes narrowed his gaze, drifting toward the hallway. He didn't ask questions initially, but the tension in the air was palpable as he stepped into the kitchen. The silence that followed was broken by a low, inquisitive chuff that vibrated through the walls, a sound that no dog or house cat could ever produce. Caleb set the basket down slowly, his hand instinctively reaching for the spot where his service weapon used to sit. He looked at Martha, seeing the exhaustion in her eyes and the smudge of red mud on her sleeve, and he knew. He walked past her toward the office, his boots thumping heavy on the linoleum. Martha didn't try to stop him. She followed him, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. When Caleb pushed open the door, he froze his breath, catching in a ragged gasp. Duke was standing on the examination table, his ears pricked and his tail twitching, a miniature king presiding over a room of medicine and shadows. The cub didn't growl. Instead, he tilted his head, watching the newcomer with a calm, piercing focus. Caleb stayed silent for a long time, his gaze moving from the lion to the surgical supplies and then to Martha. He saw the scars on Duke's flank and the way Martha moved toward the cub, her hand resting protectively on his golden neck. The gravity of the situation settled over him like a heavy shroud. He knew the laws of Texas, the strict regulations regarding exotic animals, and the prison time Martha was risking. He looked at the woman he had known as a pillar of the community, a healer who had once saved his own hand after a ranching accident, and he saw a desperation he couldn't ignore. Caleb finally spoke, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that carried the weight of 100 unsaid warnings. He told her she was a fool, that she was playing with a fire that would eventually burn her whole world down. He spoke of the danger to the town, the liability if Duke ever escaped, and the inevitable arrival of the authorities. But as he watched the cub lean into Martha's touch, he also saw the humanity in her madness. He saw that Duke wasn't a trophy or a whim. He was a living extension of Arthur's memory, a fierce spark of life in a house that had been cold for too long. Caleb didn't call the sheriff. Instead, he spent the next 3 hours helping Martha reinforce the office door and brainstorming ways to secure the barn for the day when Duke would be too large for the house. He became the silent partner in her crime, the only person who knew that a piece of the African savanna was breathing in the heart of the Texas scrub. He brought extra grain for the cattle he told Martha to buy, providing a cover for the increased activity on the ranch. The worry never left his eyes, a constant shadow that mirrored the growing size of the cub. Every time he looked at Duke, he saw a ticking clock, a countdown to a moment when the wild would become too big to hide. Yet he also began to bring old tires and heavy ropes for the cub to play with, watching from the doorway as Martha and Duke navigated their secret world. The sanctuary was no longer just a room, it was a pact made in the dust, a promise between two old friends to protect a miracle at any cost. The Texas sky outside remained vast and indifferent, but inside the ranch house, the air was charged with a new, dangerous purpose. Martha knew the peace wouldn't last forever, that the whispers of the wind would eventually carry the secret to ears that wouldn't understand. But for now, as she watched Duke sleep under the watchful eye of Caleb Vance, she felt a grim satisfaction. She had turned her grief into a shield, and though the wildfire was still burning in her palms, she was no longer afraid of the heat. The bond was forged, the secret was shared, and the king was growing his golden shadow, lengthening across the floors of the ranch, a silent herald of the storm that was surely coming. By the 3rd year, Duke no longer fit in the house, but the house could no longer breathe without him. The transition from a cub to a 200-kilogram apex predator happened with a terrifying silent speed, turning the ranch office into a space that felt increasingly fragile under the weight of his golden presence. Martha Higgins watched as his shoulders broadened, his muscles rippling under a coat that had deepened to the color of burnished Texas sand. His every movement carried a lethal grace, a reminder that the small animal she had once held in her canvas coat was now a creature capable of bringing down a bull. To accommodate his immense size and natural needs, Caleb Vance had helped her convert the old stone barn into a fortified enclosure, a hidden fortress within the ranch that allowed Duke a semblance of the wild while keeping him shielded from prying eyes. The stone walls were thick, reinforced with heavy steel mesh that Caleb had sourced from an old industrial site, costing Martha over $4,000 in materials and silent favors. The barn became a realm of shadows and straw, where the scent of dry grass mingled with the raw, musky odor of a lion in his prime. Despite the physical barrier of the barn, Duke's connection to Martha remained the center of his world, a bond that had evolved from dependency into a fierce, protective devotion. He knew the specific sound of her boots on the gravel long before she reached the door, his low, vibrating purr echoing against the stone like the hum of a distant engine. But as his body grew, so did his territorial instincts, an ancient programming that no amount of human kindness could fully suppress. He began to spend his nights pacing the perimeter of the indoor enclosure, his ears twitching at the slightest sound from the surrounding scrubland. The Texas night was no longer just a backdrop of wind and cicadas. It was a battlefield of scents and vibrations that Duke monitored with a chilling intensity. This heightened awareness became a necessity when a group of illegal trophy hunters began operating in the neighboring county, lured by rumors of exotic sightings and a lack of local law enforcement. These men were professionals of the worst kind, utilizing thermal imaging and silenced rifles to harvest wildlife under the cover of a new moon. On a windless Friday night, the air hanging heavy with the scent of ozone, Duke's behavior shifted from calm to predatory. He didn't pace. He crouched his belly fur, brushing the straw, his golden eyes fixed on the northern wall of the barn. Martha felt the change in the atmosphere the moment she stepped inside to bring him his nightly ration of raw beef. The air felt charged, vibrating with a tension she had only experienced during the great storms of her youth. She saw Duke's tail twitching with a rhythmic, violent snap, his upper lip pulled back just enough to reveal the serrated edges of his canines. Outside, the crunch of gravel under heavy tires was faint, but to a lion it was as loud as a gunshot. Two men, armed with high-caliber rifles and arrogant in their perceived invisibility, had crossed Martha's fence line, drawn by the strange, musky scent they couldn't quite identify. They thought they were hunting a mountain lion, or perhaps a rogue black bear, never dreaming that a king of the savanna was watching them through the ventilation slats of a stone barn. As the hunters approached the building, their flashlights cutting jagged holes in the darkness, Duke let out a sound that Martha had never heard before. It wasn't a chuff or a hiss. It was a primal warning, a low-frequency vibration that seemed to bypass the ears and strike directly at the bone. Martha froze her hand, gripping the iron latch of the inner gate, realizing that the secret she had guarded for 3 years was about to shatter. The hunters stopped their bravado, evaporating as the very earth beneath their feet seemed to tremble. One of them, a man with a jagged scar across his chin, raised his rifle toward the barn door, his finger tensing on the trigger. In that heartbeat, Duke launched himself against the reinforced steel mesh, the impact sounding like a car crash. He didn't just growl. He roared a sound so immense and terrifying that it tore through the silence of the Texas plains for miles. It was a vocalization of pure, unadulterated power, a declaration of ownership that stripped the hunters of their humanity and turned them into prey. The sound sent a shockwave through the scrubland, causing the cattle in the distant pastures to stampede and the birds to take flight in a panicked cloud. The hunters didn't wait to see what was behind the door. They dropped their expensive equipment and fled toward their truck, their screams of terror lost in the wake of Duke's fury. They scrambled into their vehicle tires, spinning wildly in the red mud as they raced toward the highway, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the roar itself. Martha stood in the darkness of the barn, her heart racing as she watched Duke pace the length of the mesh, his mane bristling his breath, coming in hot, ragged bursts. She realized then that the roar had changed everything. It was no longer a secret kept within the walls of a ranch house. It was a ghost story that would haunt the local bars and the sheriff's office by morning. People in Texas knew the sound of a cougar and the howl of a wolf, but they had never heard the voice of a lion. The sound was too deep, too ancient, and too foreign to be ignored. Caleb Vance arrived 20 minutes later, his truck skidding to a halt near the barn, his face pale in the moonlight. He didn't ask what happened. He had heard the roar from his own ranch 5 miles away, a sound that had made his hunting dogs cower in their kennels. He looked at Martha, seeing the grim realization in her eyes, and knew that their time in the shadows was drawing to a close. The hunters would tell stories, perhaps exaggerated, perhaps fueled by fear, but the seed of doubt had been planted. Martha walked to the mesh, ignoring the heat radiating from Duke's massive body, and rested her hand against the steel. Duke stopped his pacing, his head leaning into the spot where her fingers touched the metal, his breathing slowing as he recognized her scent. She saw the conflict in his eyes, the wild demand for freedom and the domestic need for her presence. She understood that by saving his life, she had created a beautiful, impossible contradiction. She couldn't release him into a world that would kill him, and she couldn't keep him in a world that would cage him. The roar had been a cry of protection, a shield he had thrown over her, but it was also a bell that couldn't be unrung. As the moon climbed higher, casting long, skeletal shadows across the ranch, Martha knew that the curiosity of the world would soon come knocking at her gate. The hunter's equipment lay abandoned in the dirt, a silent testament to the night the lion claimed his territory. Martha looked out toward the horizon where the distant lights of the town flickered like cold stars and felt a profound sense of isolation. She was no longer just a woman living on a ranch. She was the keeper of a mystery that was now too loud to hide. The house was quiet. The ranch was still, but the air remained thick with the echo of that first magnificent roar, a sound that had rewritten the laws of her life and set them on a collision course with a future she could no longer control. The sound of a government engine is different from a neighbor's truck. It carries the cold weight of law. 3 days had passed since the roar had shattered the peace of the Texas scrub, and the air around the Higgins ranch remained thick with an unspoken dread. Martha Higgins stood behind the lace curtains of her kitchen window, her fingers trembling slightly as a white SUV with the seal of the Department of Fish and Wildlife pulled into her gravel driveway. The dust kicked up by the tires hung in the stagnant air, a hazy veil that seemed to shroud the inevitable confrontation. She had spent the previous 48 hours moving Duke from the stone barn to the old root cellar beneath the main house, a back-breaking task that required every ounce of her remaining strength and Caleb Vance's silent assistance. The cellar was a relic of a different era, built with thick limestone blocks and a heavy oak door that sat flush against the pantry floor, hidden beneath a weathered, braided rug. It was cramped, cool, and carried the faint scent of damp earth and fermented grapes, a temporary cage for a king who belonged to the horizon. As the car door clicked shut, a man stepped out into the harsh midday sun, his movements precise and devoid of the casual rhythm common to the locals. He was younger than Martha expected, perhaps in his mid-30s, with a sharp, analytical gaze and a uniform that was pressed with military-grade precision. This was Julian Reed, a specialist known for his relentless pursuit of illegal exotic animal trade, a man whose reputation for following the letter of the law preceded him. Martha smoothed her apron and stepped onto the porch, her face a mask of practiced indifference as he approached the steps. Julian didn't start with a greeting. He held up a small handheld recording device and asked if she recognized the frequency of the sound reported by 2 frightened men in the county hospital. Martha tilted her head, her voice steady as she claimed, the hunters were likely spooked by a rogue mountain lion, or perhaps a recording played to deter trespassers. She invited him inside for coffee, a classic Texas gesture of hospitality used as a tactical shield to keep him away from the outbuildings. The kitchen felt smaller with his presence, the air vibrating with the tension of a predator, sensing a hidden rival. Julian Reed sat at the wooden table, his eyes scanning every corner of the room, lingering on the heavy scratch marks near the baseboards that Martha had tried to sand away. He spoke of the biological impossibility of a cougar producing a roar of such depth, his voice a calm, clinical drone that made Martha's skin crawl. He mentioned the abandoned rifles found on her property and the legal ramifications of harboring a Tier 1 predator without a federal permit. The interrogation was a subtle war of attrition, with Julian throwing out bait and Martha carefully sidestepping each trap. Just as the silence between them began to grow heavy, the floorboards beneath the rug in the pantry gave a faint, rhythmic creak, the sound of 200 kilograms of muscle shifting in the darkness below. Martha's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird, but she didn't flinch, instead reaching for the kettle to mask the vibration. Julian's head snapped toward the pantry, his eyes narrowing as he leaned forward, his senses suddenly heightened. He stood up slowly, moving toward the hallway with a deliberate pace that felt like a predator stalking prey. He asked if she had any pets, perhaps a large dog that was kept indoors during the heat of the day. Before he could reach the rug, the screen door groaned open, and Caleb Vance stepped inside his boots, thumping with an authoritative weight that demanded attention. Caleb didn't wait for an introduction. He placed his old sheriff's hat on the counter and looked Julian Reed directly in the eye, his presence filling the gap between the investigator and the secret beneath the floor. Caleb spoke with the gravelly confidence of a man who had spent 30 years enforcing the law in this county, asserting that he had been on the ranch every night for a week, helping Martha with a coyote problem. He leaned against the pantry door, his massive frame acting as a human barrier, and claimed the roar was nothing more than a faulty generator and the panicked imaginations of 2 criminals who were lucky he hadn't arrested them for trespassing. The air in the room seemed to crackle as the two men locked eyes, one representing the rigid bureaucracy of the state, the other representing the deep-rooted loyalty of the land. Julian Reed wasn't convinced, but he also knew that challenging a man like Caleb Vance without physical evidence was a professional risk he wasn't yet ready to take. He mentioned that he would be back with a warrant and a thermal imaging team if the reports continued his tone, carrying a promise of return that felt like a death sentence. He stepped back onto the porch, the sun glinting off his silver badge, and told Martha that the wild has a way of making itself known no matter how deep you bury it. As his SUV disappeared back down the long driveway, the silence that returned to the ranch was deafening. Caleb didn't move for several minutes, his hand still gripping the handle of the pantry door until his knuckles turned white. He looked at Martha, and for the first time she saw a flicker of genuine fear in the former officer's eyes. He whispered that they were running out of time, that Julian Reed was a bloodhound who wouldn't stop until he found the scent. Martha sank into her chair, the weight of the last 5 years finally threatening to crush her. She realized that the root cellar was no longer a sanctuary. It was a tomb. Duke was silent now, as if he understood the danger that had just stood inches from his hiding place, his primal intelligence sensing the shift from protector to fugitive. The house felt cold despite the Texas heat, the shadows stretching long and jagged across the linoleum floor. Martha knew that Julian wouldn't wait for a warrant if he heard one more sound, one more slip of the mask. She had spent a fortune, over $10,000 in total, to keep Duke fed and hidden, but money couldn't buy silence from a world that was suddenly listening. Every wind that rattled the shutters and every coyote that howled in the distance felt like a direct threat to the golden miracle she was harboring. Caleb told her he would sleep in the barn for the next few nights, keeping a watch for any department vehicles lurking near the fence line. Martha nodded, her mind already racing toward the next move, though she felt like a chess player with only a king left on the board. She waited until the moon was high before she rolled back the rug and lifted the heavy oak door. The heat from Duke's body rose to meet her, a warm, musky wave that carried the scent of life and defiance. He didn't rush out. He simply looked up at her, his amber eyes reflecting the dim light of the kitchen, seeing the exhaustion and the terror she tried so hard to hide from the world. She reached down her fingers, grazing the coarse fur of his forehead, and felt the steady, powerful thrum of his heartbeat. He was her fiercely loyal protector, but in this moment he was also her greatest vulnerability. The War of the Wild and the Law had officially begun on the dusty plains of Texas, and Martha Higgins knew that the price of her compassion was about to become higher than she ever imagined. She closed the cellar door with a soft click, the sound echoing through the empty house like the ticking of a clock that was rapidly approaching midnight. Death doesn't always come with a scythe. Sometimes it's just a sudden, cold silence in the chest. The Texas winter had arrived with a vengeance, bringing a rare and brutal ice storm that transformed the dusty plains into a jagged landscape of frozen silver. Martha Higgins sat in her favorite armchair near the hearth, the fire flickering low as the wind rattled the window panes like a desperate intruder. She had just finished securing the pantry door above Duke's cellar when a sharp, searing pain exploded behind her ribs, radiating down her left arm with the intensity of an electric shock. The world tilted on its axis, the familiar scents of cedarwood and lavender replaced by a metallic antiseptic tang that filled her mouth. She tried to reach for the phone on the side table, her fingers brushing the polished wood, but her muscles refused to obey, her strength evaporating like mist under a harsh sun. As she collapsed onto the rug, the silence of the house felt suffocating, a heavy shroud that threatened to extinguish the flickering spark of her life. Beneath the floorboards, Duke felt the shift in the atmosphere long before the first groan escaped Martha's lips. To a lion, the heartbeat of his pride is the rhythm of the world, and Martha's heart had suddenly become a stuttering, failing engine. He began to pace the confined space of the root cellar, his paws thumping against the limestone with a frantic, rhythmic urgency. The low, vibrating chuff he usually reserved for greetings turned into a guttural moan of distress, his golden eyes scanning the darkness for an exit that didn't exist. When the sound of Martha's body hitting the floor echoed through the wood, Duke's instinct for protection overrode every lesson of silence she had ever taught him. He didn't just push against the cellar door, he launched his 200-kilogram frame against it with the force of a battering ram. The heavy oak groaned the ancient hinges, screaming in protest as the wood splintered under his immense power. With one final violent surge, the door gave way, and Duke exploded into the kitchen, his mane bristling with a primal fury. He reached Martha's side in a single bound, his large, sandpaper-like tongue rasping against her cold cheek in a desperate attempt to rouse her. Her eyes remained closed, her breathing shallow and ragged, a sound that drove a spike of panic through his wild heart. Duke knew he couldn't save her here, in the stillness of this dying house, and his ancestral memory told him that he needed the other member of their small secret pride. He turned toward the back door, the reinforced glass shattered by a single blow from his massive paw, and leapt out into the freezing night. The ice storm was at its peak, the air filled with stinging needles of frozen rain that matted his fur and blurred his vision. Caleb Vance's ranch lay 5 miles to the north, a distance that seemed impossible in the whiteout conditions of a Texas blizzard. Duke didn't hesitate. He settled into a powerful rhythmic lope, his muscles rippling under the cold as he carved a path through the drifting snow. The landscape was a treacherous maze of fallen branches and frozen creeks, but the scent of Caleb, faint but recognizable, acted as a beacon in the dark. He ran with a singular, desperate purpose, his breath coming in hot white plumes that vanished in the wind. Every mile was a battle against the elements, his paws bleeding from the jagged ice, but the silence in Martha's chest drove him forward. Meanwhile, Caleb Vance was driving back from an emergency patrol, his heavy-duty truck sliding precariously on the black ice of the county road. The heater was humming a thin shield against the brutal cold when his headlights caught a flash of gold moving through the brush at the edge of the woods. He slowed down, thinking it was a large buck or perhaps a stray calf, but as the figure emerged onto the asphalt, his heart stopped. Standing in the middle of the road, illuminated by the harsh glare of the halogen beams, was the massive frozen silhouette of a lion. Duke didn't cower or run. He stood his ground, his mane covered in icicles, his chest heaving with the exertion of his 5-mile sprint. Caleb slammed on the brakes, the truck fishtailing, before coming to a dead stop inches from the predator. He reached for the shotgun in the rack behind him, his pulse hammering a frantic rhythm against his neck, thinking the beast had finally turned rogue. But as he looked into Duke's eyes, he didn't see aggression. He saw a piercing, intelligent desperation that mirrored Martha's own gaze. Duke let out a roar, not the territorial declaration of a hunter, but a soul-wrenching cry for help that vibrated through the metal of the truck. He turned toward the direction of Martha's ranch, and then back to Caleb, his tail lashing the air in a violent command. Caleb froze the realization of what this meant, hitting him with the force of a physical blow. Duke wouldn't be out here 5 miles from his sanctuary unless the world had ended. He dropped the gun, shifted the truck into gear, and shouted for Duke to lead the way. What followed was a surreal, high-speed race through the frozen wasteland, the lion running alongside the truck with a speed that defied the treacherous terrain. Duke guided him through the back pastures, bypassing the drifted roads, his golden form a ghost in the swirling snow. When they reached the Higgins ranch, Caleb didn't wait for the truck to stop. He leapt out, following Duke through the shattered back door. He found Martha on the rug, her face ashen, her life hanging by a thread that was rapidly fraying. Caleb's medical training from his days in the service kicked in as he began the desperate work of resuscitation, his hands steady despite the cold. Duke didn't interfere. He sat in the corner of the room, a silent golden sentinel whose presence seemed to anchor Martha to the world of the living. As the sirens of the ambulance finally approached through the storm, the paramedics arrived to a scene that would haunt their dreams for years. A former officer working feverishly over a fallen woman while a massive frost-covered lion watched from the shadows with the gravity of a mourning king. Caleb stood between the paramedics and Duke his authority, ensuring that no one drew a weapon, his voice a low, hard command that protected the beast who had just saved the woman they both loved. The miracle wasn't just that Martha's heart began to beat again. It was that a creature of the wild had chosen to bridge the gap between two worlds to preserve a single fragile life. As the stretcher was loaded into the ambulance, Duke followed them to the driveway, his low, vibrating moan, a farewell that echoed across the frozen plains. The icy wind continued to howl, but the silence in Martha's chest had been broken, replaced by the steady, rhythmic promise of survival. Caleb looked at the lion, seeing the blood on his paws and the exhaustion in his frame, and realized that the secret was no longer theirs to keep. The world would know about Duke now, but they would also know that the fiercest protector in Texas wasn't a man with a badge, but a lion with a heart of gold. The ice storm began to taper off, leaving behind a world that was cold, white, and forever changed by the night. The king ran through the snow to save his queen. Martha Higgins was gone, taken to a hospital miles away. But her spirit remained in the ranch, guarded by a predator who had proven that loyalty is a language that needs no words. Caleb watched Duke retreat into the shadows of the stone barn, knowing that the real battle, the battle for Duke's life and freedom, was only just beginning. The hospital bed felt like a cage, but the real prison was waiting for Duke back at the farm. Martha Higgins stared at the sterile white ceiling of the Dallas Intensive Care Unit. The rhythmic beep of the heart monitor a pale imitation of the deep thrumming purr she had left behind in the Texas scrub. Her body was frail, her movements restricted by tubes and monitors, but her mind was back on the ranch, sensing the storm of steel and bureaucracy that was descending upon her sanctuary. News of the lion had spread through the county like a wildfire after the paramedics witnessed the impossible sight in her kitchen, and Julian Reed had not wasted a single second. 3 days after her collapse against the frantic advice of her doctors, Martha signed her own discharge papers, her hands shaking as she pulled on her worn canvas coat over her hospital gown. She reached the ranch gates just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, blood-red shadows across the gravel. The driveway was no longer a path to a home. It was a staging ground for a military operation. 4 black SUVs with government markings were parked in a semicircle around the stone barn, their headlights cutting through the twilight like cold, prying eyes. A dozen men in tactical gear stood with rifles at the ready, the metallic clatter of their equipment, a jarring violation of the desert's natural silence. At the center of the perimeter stood Julian Reed, his face a grim mask of duty as he oversaw the preparation of heavy tranquilizer rifles and steel containment crates. The air was thick with the scent of diesel and the electric hum of a portable generator, a technological siege against a creature of the wild. Martha pushed through the line of officers, her voice a raspy but authoritative command that forced the armed men to hesitate. She ignored the pain in her chest and the dizziness that threatened to pull her into the dirt, walking directly into the line of fire until she stood between the muzzles of the guns and the barn door. Inside the stone walls, Duke's reaction to the intrusion was visceral and terrifying. He could smell the fear and the unfamiliar sense of the men outside, but more importantly, he could sense Martha's return and the danger she was facing. He didn't just growl. He threw himself against the reinforced mesh with a rhythmic, bone-shaking violence that made the stone walls of the barn vibrate. Every impact was followed by a roar that seemed to tear the very air apart, a vocalization of pure, unbridled protective fury. The tactical team adjusted their aim, their fingers tightening on triggers as they faced a predator that sounded like a force of nature gone rogue. Julian Reed stepped forward, his voice amplified by a megaphone, demanding that Martha move aside for her own safety. He spoke of public liability, of the illegal nature of Duke's existence, and the imminent threat a 200-kilogram lion posed to the surrounding community. But Martha didn't budge. She looked Julian directly in the eye, her gaze a mirror of the same fierce intelligence he saw in the beast behind her. She told him the Duke wasn't the threat the men with guns were. She recounted the night of the ice storm, detailing how the creature they called a monster had run 5 miles through a blizzard to save the life of the woman who had once saved his. She argued that Duke had proven more humanity in a single night than the laws Julian was trying to enforce had shown in a decade. The standoff was a clash of two worlds, the rigid, cold logic of the law and the messy, profound reality of a bond that defied biology. As she spoke, the barn door creaked open slightly from the pressure of Duke's lunges, revealing a glimpse of golden fur and eyes that burned with a lethal amber fire. One of the younger officers, spooked by the sheer intensity of the lion's gaze, let his rifle slip the barrel, clattering against his tactical vest. The sound was enough to trigger Duke's final defensive instinct. He let out a roar so massive it caused several men to retreat instinctively, the sound wave physically pushing against their chests. Julian Reed raised his hand to stop his team from firing, his analytical mind finally faltering in the face of such raw, selfless devotion. He saw the way Martha reached back toward the door, her fingers grazing the wood, and how the violent thuds inside immediately softened into a low, anxious moan. She wasn't just a harborer of an exotic animal, she was the heart of a pride. Martha made her final plea, offering a compromise that stripped her of her secret but preserved Duke's life. She spoke of a specialized wildlife sanctuary in the mountains of Colorado, a place where Duke could have the space he needed while remaining under the care of those who understood his unique history. She offered to turn over her entire life savings, over $50,000, including the value of the ranch, to fund his transport and permanent care, provided he was never put down. Julian Reed looked from the defiant, fragile woman to the powerful, unseen king in the barn, and for the first time, the cold weight of the law seemed to lighten. He realized that killing Duke wouldn't be an act of public safety. It would be the execution of a hero. He signaled for his men to lower their weapons, the tension in the air dissipating like a receding tide. The decision was made not in a courtroom, but in the dust of a Texas ranch, where the heart proved more powerful than the badge. Julian agreed to facilitate the transfer, but under the strictest federal supervision, ensuring that Duke would never again be a secret. As the containment crate was moved into position, Martha was allowed one final moment inside the barn. The air was quiet now, the only sound, the rhythmic breathing of a lion who had fought a war for his queen. Duke approached her with a slow, heavy grace, his head bowing to meet her hand. There were no roars, only a soft, sandpaper-like lick against her palm and a low vibration that rumbled through her very bones. She whispered her gratitude into his mane, the scent of wild grass and sun-warmed fur filling her senses for the last time. She knew that by saving him today, she was losing him forever to a life behind a different kind of fence. But it was a price she paid with a grateful heart. The crates were loaded under the silver light of a rising moon, the SUVs beginning their slow procession away from the ranch. Martha stood on the porch, her coat flapping in the wind, watching the taillights disappear into the dark. The barn was empty, the house was silent, and the secret was gone, but the air still held the echo of a roar that had changed the world. She wasn't just a survivor of a stroke. She was a woman who had stood before a firing squad for a friend and won. The Texas plains felt vast and lonely once more, but as she looked up at the stars, Martha Higgins felt a profound peace. The final stand was over. The king was safe, and the bond they shared had rewritten the laws of nature in the red dust of the Lone Star State. True protection isn't about claws or teeth. It's about the heart that chooses to stay. The dust of the standoff eventually settled, giving way to a new era where the Higgins Ranch was no longer a place of secrets, but a sanctuary of global significance. Through a complex legal maneuver and the surprising advocacy of Julian Reed, the property was designated as the Lone Star Apex Sanctuary, the first private-public partnership of its kind in Texas history. Martha Higgins remained the primary guardian, though she now shared her days with a team of specialized veterinarians and conservationists